Good morning, everyone. My name is Nora, and I will be your tour guide for this virtual tour at our museum here today. Today, I'm going to be taking you through our exhibition, The Lens of Art and Literature, the Lares called. And so the main focuses for today, I'm just going to lay it out for you right now so that once we get into the exhibition itself, it's clear where we're going. And so the original thing that we're going to focus on is identifying the Lares, who they were, what kind of gods they are, then also where they come from, what origin stories look like, both from Roman literature and from artwork. And then we will also be looking at the purpose of the Lares was, what cult worship to them look like, and what differences there might be in rural versus urban religion and private versus public religion. So this is our website here real quick. And so this is our visiting guide that you can look at any time. I'll provide the link for you guys at the end of this tour. So we have our front page here. It has a little bit of an overview of the exhibition if you would like to come look at it. And then here is a list of our exhibition objects that I'm going to be taking you through in a little bit here today, just so you get a look at it. And so for our virtual gallery that we're going to be going to in a few minutes, the link is also here on the website if you want to look at it at another time, and the sources that we'll be using in these images here that are displayed above. So let's get into it then. Okay, so this is the main room of our exhibition. There are two rooms in it, separated, one by the artwork that we're going to be looking at today, and in the other room that we will enter into shortly when we discuss the literature that we'll be looking at is in the other room. Before we go through that, though, I want to provide you with a little bit of background before we go into the deeper analysis and take a quick take a deeper look into each of the objects that we have here today. And so for the nature of the Lares, they were primarily seen by the Romans as ancient deities who were present in this world that was full of gods. And these deities in particular were typically found in the home. They were also found on the farm and street corners in towns, as there were gods that were frequently found at crossroads, which we'll take a look at why that might be in a little bit. Their main purpose that has been heavily attested in ancient literature and ancient history is that they were guardian gods that were primarily identified with specific places, such as, like I said, the crossroads or households or farms. And there's some debate on if the Romans saw them also as being spirits of deceased family members, spirits of the dead, or any other deities that might be connected in some way to their ancestors that wasn't through a more abstract understanding of them as being gods and guardians of the Roman people. And so there are a few cult sites that we'll be looking at in the images here. Primarily, it could be the cult was in both private and public spheres. So a more private sphere would look like in a home, either in an atrium or in a kitchen. This is more public cult sites could be found in temples, two of which were supposedly in Rome, the Lares and Summa Sacrovia, which was understood to be Lares that were general protectors of Rome, of Rome's fields, her armies, and her people. And it was most likely an archaic temple that we're not entirely sure of where it was. Then there's also the Lares Permini, which was supposedly on the Campus Martius, which honored Lares protectors of the seas. This was built in the early 2nd century BC, around 102, and this was primarily after a military victory by sea of a general who then his family created this temple supposedly to honor these new type of Lares, as Lares were not generally tied with the sea, just as the Romans were not generally tied to the sea until it became a more metropolitan empire. There are also crossroad shrines called the Compita, which were sites for official public cult and part of a network of shrines that would be throughout either cities such as Rome and Pompeii, as we're going to look at, or throughout maybe more rural areas, but at crossroads. And so different rituals that were both public and private that we'll get into as well is a special sacrifice of a pig, which was then a larger animal that when the sacrifice happened, it would then feed the entire neighborhood. So again, tying in the sense of crossroads and neighborhood that we can see as in some of these shrines that we're going to be looking at. There are also libations that would be poured out for the Lares, which we can also have a look at. And then also connections with garlands and flowers and the Compitalia festival. And with that, let's get into our artifacts here today. So we're actually going to take a look at the literature first before we get into the artwork. We're going to start with Ovid's Fasti. In Ovid's Fasti, he often provides origin stories for specific myths, for specific Roman myths. And so we're going to take a look at his example of that as he's describing the Lares. So according to Ovid, there was a Naiad nymph named Lara, who was then taken to a grove and won the heart of Jupiter in his story. And in his quote, he says he would have used force. For want of words, she pleaded with a look, and all in vain she strove to speak with her dumb lips. She went with child and bore twins, who guard the crossroads and ever keep watch in our city. They are the Lares. And so this is where and so this seems to be an origin of why there are two of them. There is the divine twins, again, connected to possibly the origin story of Rome itself with Romulus and Remus. And so the significance of having the mother of the Lares being named and being identified is that she also often remains an elusive figure, and there's a lot of debate even within Roman society and Roman authors that we can look at of where the Lares even came from, who their parentage, and there's a lot of less emphasis on who the father might have been. Possibly because of the role of the Lares as protectors and of the mother being responsible for birthing these protectors and guarding the city of Rome and the people of Rome. And so he also speaks to the original interaction of the Lares with the Romans, where he says that when Rome was founded, the Lares were ordered to be transferred to new quarters, and that while changing homes, they set fire to their rustic roofs and the cottage about to be abandoned. And so these gods seem to be, in this quote, these gods seem to be movable gods. And this was a concept that happened with the Lares often, as they could even be found as little statues that were within the atriums in the atrium shrine that we'll take a look at in a bit. And so it shows this movement of gods, this exchanging between different areas, different homes, and as being kind of tied to the sense of a rustic roof in a cottage in a home. And so that kind of speaks to the Lares not only being confined to maybe a household or maybe to an urban setting, and that it is tied to this rural, this origins, originality of the Lares as being more rustic gods. And so in the earlier quote, it mentions that the two are supposedly conceived in a grove between Lara and between Jupiter in this story. And so that does, again, tie the Lares to a more rural setting than supposedly just being at the crossroads, having these shrines that are within urban households, as they came to be later on, and that we have more examples of through both artwork and literature. And so when considering Ovid as a possible source for the origins of the Lares, it is important to note that he often uses storytelling, either as a joke for satire or creating his own accounts. That kind of speaks to the uncertainty of ancient and modern scholars as to the origins of the Lares, how their purpose originated as serving as protectors of the Romans. Ovid also speaks to then the purpose of the Lares, and then how altars are then founded. And so in a quote here, he says, "The Kalends of May witnessed the foundation of an altar to the guardian Lares, together with small images of the gods. They guard all things by their eyes. They also stand for us and preside over the city hills. They also stand for us and preside over the city walls, and they are present and bring us aid, are faithful to their master. Crossroads are dear to the gods. I sought for images of the god twins. In the city, there are 1,000 Lares." So this quote both speaks to the sheer amount of Lares in the city of Rome, and that their primary role, as seen by the Romans themselves, was being these guardians, these protectors who are present in both the city walls and throughout the neighborhoods and are guarding the people of Rome with their eyes and with their protection. And so also for the foundation of an altar. It's tied to then where, in another quote, he says, the Lares are given a sanctuary on the spot where many a wreath is twined by deft hands. And so in the sense of how then offerings were given to the Lares, he also offers some insights into that, saying, give essence, give he also offers insights into the offerings giving the Lares by saying, give essence to the family gods, you virtuous ones, and offer food that the Lares in their girt up robes may feed at the platter presented to them as a pledge of the homage that they love. It is heavily attested that incense and food in the form of cakes and honey and pouring libations were offerings that were given to many gods and specifically to the Lares. And it is notable here that in Ovid, the translation refers to the Lares as family gods. So in this one sense, this is an homage that would be happening in a private context within a household. So next, we're going to take a look at Tibellus. So in Tibullus, he says, surrounding the origins, that in the country, the lad first made a circlet from the flowers of spring and placed it on the ancient Lares' head. So this is a connection to later images that we'll see about the Lares and about the depiction of these gods. And the tie of flowers of spring to then being a crown that was then given to the Lares. So we'll see that in a bit. Also for their purpose, he says, yet save me, Lares of my fathers. Ye too did rear me when I ran, a little child, before your feet. This again speaks to the protection aspect of these gods, that they're watching over the people of Rome, they're watching over Rome from their place as ancient gods, who are then seeing how the city, how the people are evolving from the Republic and from a rural settings then to this big empire that has many different aspects to it. And yet these gods still these gods are still present in all of these households. There's still a sense of offerings that are given to the Lares in return for this protection. As he later says, O Lares, turn the bronze javelins away from me, and as thank offering for my safe return shall a hog from the full sty, a farmer's victim, be sacrificed. And so this again speaks to the specific types of sacrifice that were then given to the Lares. Again, a pig from the full sty, and this is a specifically chosen pig, serving as a victim, a sacrifice for these gods, for offering safe return, for offering protection in many different contexts, and as being a protector overall of the Roman people and of the people who are then giving these offerings to them. And then again, the Lares then, in another quote, he says, ye too, my Lares, who watch over an estate, now poor though thriving ones, receive your gifts. So even under times of duress, even times when the Lares is possibly not doing or fulfilling the role that they're supposedly having of making sure of watching over this estate that was once thriving but now is not, and yet despite all this, he's still giving gifts to the gods, that there's still gods that are carried with the Romans, that are still paid homage to even in times of uncertainty, in times of where wealth is lacking. And so this speaks to their overall connection to the Roman people, and that this is not one that's easily going to be broken either by unfortunate circumstances or by not having enough. That this is a god. These are gods that you're taking with you despite everything. These are gods that are protecting you from childhood, then to adulthood and in war, but also in your household and your estate and watching over that. So next we're going to go to Cato, who describes the Lares in a really rural context, specifically surrounding his farms and the aspects of a good farm. And so Cato represents the cult of the household lair, and he really closely associates it with the hearth of households, but then also the edges of his property as being kind of essential to the existence of his ideal farm, that these edges that are protected by the Lares are making a boundary, both religiously and symbolically, and a physical one of what is his land and what is protected by his gods that he's worshiping. And then on the offerings, he speaks about on the farm who's allowed to make certain offerings to these gods and when that should occur. And so for the female slave or freed woman who's monitoring the slaves of this estate when the owners are not there, he says that on the calends, the ides, the nones of each month, and where there's a religious holiday, she should hang a garland on the hearth and should make requests to the household lair on those days, accompanied by offerings. And so in this sense, again, it's the woman who's this woman, either slave or freed woman, who's on each of these prescribed days of every month is then performing these religious aspects, performing this ritual of hanging the garland on the earth, where it has ties to the Lares, and also making requests on those gods of those specific days, after giving offerings, after having this ritual aspect of hanging the garland on the hearth, as discussed before. And this is her fulfilling her ritual, her religious activities for the household. So this is her speaking for the household, making requests to these household gods on these days for the farm in itself. The male version of this is that he should not perform religious ritual except on the Compitalia, at the crossroads shrine, or at the hearth. So this is again speaking to different, both in gender and both in class, of the ties to the Lares. And so the Lares were heavily tied to slaves and also to freedmen and women. And so it's important to note that this man is not allowed to perform any of these rituals except at this festival that's specifically tied to the Lares, speaking again to the connection between the Lares and slaves, which has origin stories other than Ovid's. Festivals are taking place at the crossroads and at the hearth. So again, tied to the family and tied to boundaries. His emphasis on the boundaries is also shown when he's speaking to offerings of when the father of the family, the owner of the household, then comes to this villa with the farm. He says that he should make a tour of the property that same day if he can, once he has greeted the lair of the household, surveying the land, protecting the boundaries, and greeting the Lares as being the protectors of this space. This is the ritual, this is the aspects of how you should approach your farm and your villa when the paterfamilias is coming, and that it shows the importance of greeting the Lares, of paying homage to the Lares, and then also of surveying the land as they are gods of boundaries, but also the household. So it is the two-part connection that Cato is emphasizing. So now we're going to go to have a look at some of the images that we have here. So the first one here is of a bronze statuette of a dancing Lar. And so there are two different types of statuettes of the Lares that are common, either of them dancing or standing. This is a dancing style, as emphasized by the movement of the tunic that he's wearing here. And so if we take a look at the image, you can see the long hair, he has a short tunic, he's dancing, he has the bowl for pouring libations, he has the jug here for the wine, and you can see the movement as shown through, again, his clothing and also the movement of his feet. This is a common representation of the Lares, often seen in atriums in the public rooms of the house, which had a fine line between being public and private, both because this is the area of the atrium where people are coming in, where they had the liariums. In these areas, it was rare for there to be paintings on the walls or within the shrine of the Lares. That's more often seen in kitchen cults that we'll take a look at in a second. Instead, there are mostly these small bronze statuettes and other materials that were then placed within these shrines. Moving then from the public space of the private home, we're going to take a look at this fresco from the House of the Red Walls in Pompeii. And this is showing from a central depiction in the atrium of what a painting would have looked like on these shrines. And so this speaks to, in earlier households that are simpler, there was the main focus on the central atrium, as in this one, where cooking and eating happened at one time in the single in the single room, where there was light, and this is where the Lares were the most central to families. This house And this fresco is a representation of this early aspect of the Lares, where they're connected within the atrium and not when then more rooms are added in more Hellenized villas, where the placement of the Lares was then moved. And so in this fresco here, you can see that there are three. The two on the left and on the right are identifiable as Lares from their short tunics. They also have these high boots that were commonly seen, and they have this longer hair that goes behind their backs. They're also a bit bigger than the figure in the center, again, showing the emphasis on the Lares, and that at this shrine in particular, that is the cult that's being worshipped. It also has a genius here who is wearing a toga with the purple stripe. He's also covering his head in the typical Roman fashion when performing a religious activity, which is in this sense pouring libations into the, and so this could be mistaken possibly as the paterfamilias of this household here, and a representation of him pouring libations for the Lares. But then this cornucopia here that's he's holding is not typically shown with humans. So this shows that this is a deity rather than perhaps a paterfamilias or an actual member of the family household. So this is a representation of the genius, which is commonly then placed in between or with Lares on these shrines, but in a smaller sense to place more emphasis on the Lares. A smaller household and a more traditional household where the shrine would have been in the atrium, and that would have been the most central part of the family home. Then to this painted kitchen shrine, which comes from Villa 6 at Terzingo. This imagery again shows the Lares. There's one on each side then on this top left part of the frieze, where there are the two Lares who are slightly bigger than, again, the figure in the middle, who can be identified as the genius, the male protective spirit. And it also has two snakes here below who are facing each other, and in between there seems to be an egg or a pine cone. And these are, again, often found in Pompeii with the snakes then connected to the Lares. And so the importance of this shrine being in the kitchen is that in larger houses that were then more Hellenized, the main focus of the cult was the shrine that was in or near the kitchen, which was then moved from being the central aspect of the family then to the domestic realm of slaves. Again, speaking to the ties between slaves and the Lares cult and how they were able to then have religious connections to the Lares. And this was shown through their participation in many of the festivals and in paying homage to the gods on behalf of the family, as we saw earlier in Tibullus. And so the association also with the hearth and with the kitchen then makes close to connection, both in addition to slaves, it makes a connection to women then who manage the household, and then slaves who are preparing the food. So speak to the Lares as being a cult for the Roman people as a whole, but also a special emphasis on women and on slaves that's not necessarily seen in a lot of other cults. We covered scenes, and it has also the snakes and the pine. About that, it's kind of hard to tell, but there's the two here, and this one's a bit bigger than the other, and it has some decoration as opposed to this one, and that is to show that it's two different snakes, that one is male and one is female, which is often receiving a separate offering for the libations. And there's also an image of a pig here, sacrificial victim to the Lares, and then celebrated in the neighborhood. So after another example from a shrine within a household, now we're going to go look at an example of a shrine in the public sphere. And so for this, we're going to Pompeii. This is an example of a shrine that of what a shrine might have looked like on the crossroads. So this would be street shrines that would have been in most, if not every neighborhood. That would have been, it is here. As you can see, it has the altar, and then it has a depiction of the Lares and the snake here, as is common in this region, as we've seen before. And it has the images then of the Lares, two of them here, and then in the middle, is images of a sacrifice, of a ritual taking place. And so this is an example really that encapsulates what these shrines would have looked like in an urban landscape, and imagining this going from different regions within a city and seeing how the city is then divided out is what can be revealed by these shrines, and then what the specific neighborhoods would then look like and how they would have taken care of these shrines. It would have been a public aspect of the neighborhood coming together and either paying for these shrines to be rebuilt, as what happened after, as we've seen, happened after the earthquake that happened in Pompeii before the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, a little earlier than that. And so there is evidence then of a lot of these shrines being rebuilt after the fact, showing, and very early on. So there are houses and other aspects that were not rebuilt, and yet these shrines is what seems to have taken precedent for the citizens of Pompeii. And so by this time, around the 1st century BC, even the cult was largely overseen by freedmen and slaves, especially at these crossroad shrines called the compita. And so this emphasis again of the slaves, as we saw earlier in Cato, is then shown to be even more relevant to these shrines that were in the public sphere. And especially so during the Compitalia festival, which occurred in the winter, in which these shrines were the ones that were being dedicated to, both as being patrons and then protectors of the local area and its boundaries. And these shrines in particular are really important in that they have the largest cross-section where different people from all different aspects of Roman society could then come together and perform common ritual actions. And this was regardless of either their social status, of their ethnicity, of their gender, especially in a cult where women and slaves were then elevated to a certain extent after the paterfamilias. And so in both town and country settings, crossroads could be larger or smaller and grander or simpler, as is the case with who was even making those offerings, that it was all different, an assortment of all different peoples. It was also an assortment of all different types of shrines, different decorations, different altars, that was really specific to each of these neighborhoods then. This is showing what a common shrine might have looked like. There are also different reforms that occurred to the Lares, the cult over time, most specifically under the time of Augustus. So for that, we're going to look at then of an altar of the Lares Augusti. And so if you look closely, you can see there's presumably the emperor, and there are these two Lares statues, such as the statuette that we saw as the first the piece of artwork, that are then being handed over, and here's an altar. And so this is significant in that in 7 BC, Augustus completed a really grand urban reform that created different regions, different administrative units within the city itself. And so this kind of revamped where each of these shrines were and how each of these neighborhoods were then divided around the common shrine. At the same time, he renamed the Lares Compitales, which are the Lares that were at these crossroad shrines that we've been looking at earlier, and he renamed them as the Lares Augusti. So this is adding in then the imperial reform and adding his name as being tied to the Lares, and kind of affords him an enhanced visibility throughout the crossroad shrines, that shows his communication with different classes, and it shows him as being a protector both of the Lares then, who he's adding his name to, and then a protector of the Roman people by extension there. He also added 2 new festivals for decorating the crossroad shrines with flowers that occurred in the spring and in the summer. Again, speaking to the ties in Tibellus and in Cato of the ties between the garlands to the Lares, shows a shift. Then by extension, as he adds in his name, the Lares become not just guardians of the city for the sake of patronage, given this homage that is then connected to the emperor. So Harriet Flower's book, The Dancing Lares and the Serpent in the Garden. In this one work, she encapsulates all of her insights into each of the cults as a way to the Romans, but also in what we can is it's providing insights by the Roman people about this culture